And the Senate is preparing to take a bill to the floor that would require the federal government to recognize same-sex marriage if it was legal in the state where it was performed. It's garnered support from some Senate Republicans after amendments to protect religious freedom were added, but others say it still infringes on religious liberty. To discuss, we're joined by legal counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom, Matt Sharp. Matt, thank you for joining me today on the Capitol Report.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, as you know, the Senate is getting ready to pass the Respect for Marriage Act, and your organization put out sent a letter to Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, urging Republicans to vote against this. I just want to know, on the surface level, what is your take on this type of legislation and the implications, the legal implications it could have related to religious freedom here in America?
Well, the so-called Respect for Marriage Act really is a disrespect to millions of Americans and organizations that still believe that marriage is the union between one man and one woman. And this law would give vast powers to the federal government, allowing it to, for example, go after the tax-exempt status of a religious nonprofit, or to allow federal lawsuits to be filed against people of faith simply that want to live consistent with their view that marriage is between a man and a woman. So we're concerned about the implications this would have for so many people and the vast new powers that it's going to give to the federal government.
So speaking of this, the restrictions it could place on the nonprofit organizations, faith-based nonprofit organizations. So that was for the House version. I was actually looking at the Senate version. It looks like Democrats were working with some Senate Republicans to propose amendments to this bill. For example, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, Susan Collins from Maine, and others. And some of the amendments that they propose, they say that they're now protecting the nonprofit organizations, and they're also protecting the religious liberty under Constitution or federal law, including the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Considering these amendments that the Senate has placed in this bill, do you still think it kind of infringes on the constitutional rights of religious Americans?
Yeah, we do. We've seen some of these amendments, and really what they do is pay lip service to religious liberty. They would still result in many faith-based organizations being exposed to costly federal lawsuits for acting consistent with their beliefs that marriage is between one man and one woman. It still creates lots of other concerns when you are redefining marriage and the trickle-down effects that would have. We've seen some proposals like from Senator Lee that have much more robust protections for religious liberty, but the bill itself is fundamentally flawed. When we redefine marriage, as we saw many states do, as we saw happen in Obergefell, it has long-term consequences for people of faith. People like Alliance Defending Freedom client Jack Phillips, the Colorado cake artist who is being sued repeatedly, or Lori Smith, who's also from Colorado and is being forced to design custom websites about marriage that violate her beliefs. So this bill itself is fundamentally flawed, and no amount of amendments or anything like that can fix those flaws with it and the threat it poses to religious liberty.
Yeah, and two follow-ups on that. So you mentioned that a bill like this would have trickle-down effects. If you could elaborate, what are those trickle-down effects?
Yeah, so one example would be a faith-based adoption provider. There's many of those that believe children thrive best in the home with a married mother and father. But because they operate in conjunction with the state in many of the instances, this could allow the federal government to come in and tell that faith-based adoption provider, you must violate your beliefs about marriage. You must place children in homes with same-sex couples, even though that violates your beliefs about what's best for a child. And so those are just some of the examples of the type of consequences that could flow from this. There's many other social service organizations that likewise could be impacted by it. And nothing in the amendments, nothing that has been talked about would resolve those underlying threats to religious liberty that this bill poses.
So could you help our audience understand how exactly a federal law like this would impact those religious Americans and open them up to these types of lawsuits?
Yeah. We've seen many states that have passed state laws like this, and these have been the laws in the state level that have been used to go after Jack Phillips or Barronelle Stutzman or other faith-based organizations across the country that Alliance Defending Freedom has been defending those individuals. Well, for the first time, we've now got a federal lawsuit available, a federal cause of action where you've got the Senate and the House would be saying, we want you to go after and sue these organizations. We want you to go after them because they just want to operate consistent with their belief that marriage is between a man and a woman, and file costly lawsuits against them, lawsuits that these organizations, they don't have the time, they don't have the financial ability to stand against all of those. Our First Amendment protects our right to free speech and our right to exercise our religion. And what this is doing is sending a message from Congress that if you hold certain beliefs that Congress disagrees with, you're going to be exposed to lawsuit. You may be losing your tax exempt status or face other federal penalties or consequences for that. And that is repugnant to our First Amendment. Our Constitution reigns supreme, and laws like this that trample those freedoms, that tell Americans that believe marriage is between a man and a woman, beliefs that the Supreme Court itself said are held by honorable and decent people, but it tells them that they don't deserve protection, that they actually ought to be punished by the federal government. That ought to trouble all of us. And that's why Alliance Defending Freedom is going to continue to stand against this bill and can stand against any efforts to go after people of faith under it.
Okay, thank you for your insights, Matt Sharp with Alliance Defending Freedom.
Thanks so much.